Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money. I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. The Treaty of Sèvres must be saved at all costs. Venizelos, November 1920. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast, episode number 21, Bread, Olives, and King Constantine, Greek Monarchism, Part 4. Nice little quote there by our ever impressive, ever important Mr. Venizelos. Let's keep going with where we left off on last episode, which was the death of King Alexander at a terrible time to die if you are a king, if you're a Greek king named Alexander. Like, just what a time. My God. Yeah, he gets bit by a monkey, he dies. There's another really famous quote, actually. Maybe you guys are familiar with it, but it goes something along the lines of, how does it go? I don't know. It's like Churchill saying something like, it's not an exaggeration to say that monkey may have cost the lives of 500,000 or 1 million people, right? Because if you think about it, the series of events that, the butterfly effect or the knock-on effect of that damn monkey biting the king and him dying, yada, yada, yada. So, like I said, we left off last. King Alexander's dead. Let's keep moving on and touch on a lot of stuff today. Venizelos, the Asia Minor campaign, the political situation, and whatnot. So as the elections in November of 1920 approach, the parties opposing the Venizelists had created a united opposition, and they ran on two major issues: what they considered Venizelist tyranny and the return of the ex-king Constantine. And this united opposition party included some names we might recognize, like Gunaris, who, of course, as we know, was executed after the trial of the Six, and Tsaldaris, who, as we also know from listening to the first primer episodes, was around during the 33 and 35 failed Venizelist coups. And then he was one of those 5 influential politicians that died in an oh-so-timely fashion, which paved the way for Metaxas to take over in 1936, right? So some of these names we'll recognize. Something else really important was that the united opposition realized that if they were going to win, they had to at least try to assuage any anxieties France and the British had or were going to have in the event of a royalist victory, right, in the elections. Because, the British and the French still very much saw King Constantine as the traitor due to his stance in World War I. Don't forget the Noemvrena. Noemvrena. It matters a lot, right? It's very consequential. So Britain and France were arguably the two countries that held the biggest sway or influence on how things went in Asia Minor, especially Britain. France a lot too, but especially Britain. So it's like definitely not a good idea to piss those guys off. And all of this is coming from a political standpoint where the royalists could say, hey, look, just because we're in office, it doesn't mean everything will go to hell in a handbasket. We, too, can play great power politics. Even though we aren't the eloquent statesman that Venizelos is, we can do that, too. So in June of 1920, they drafted and sent an official declaration to the Entente powers, assuring them of the, quote, unity of views of the Greek nation, end quote, and the, quote, unchangeable sentiments of friendship and interdependence which the Greek people feels for the allied and associated powers, end quote. So, as you can see, and this is something Dr. Pappas and I discussed in our episode on the Vienna, when the royalists came into power and saw what was at stake and that they could benefit from the situation if all went well, they continued on with the campaign in Asia Minor, but pivoted by attributing this continuation of the policy to what they owed the Greek people and to what was owed to them per the Paris Peace Conference and the United States President Wilson's ideals of self-determination and that kind of thing. So look, we aren't continuing the campaign in Asia Minor because we like Venizelos. No, it's because it's owed to the Greek people, and the Paris Peace Conference agrees with this as well. And the Greeks in Asia Minor deserve self-determination. We're still anti-Venizelists, though. Through and through, right? You guys get the idea. So Gounaris returned to Greece from his exile in October of 1920, shortly after King Alexander's death, due to him being the head of the United Opposition Party. And he stayed hot on the campaign trail. And by the end of October, the United Opposition had been renamed the Popular Party, or Populist, depending on what source you read. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they ran primarily on the issue of dynastic succession, bringing back King Constantine, and on Venizelos tyranny. We don't like Venizelos because he's acting like a dictator, yada, yada, yada. And Gounaris touches on both of these issues at a speech he gave on November 7th in a rally in Athens, where he stated a couple of things in relation to these two subjects. In regards to the issue of succession, aka the king and the dynasty, he states, and quote, actually there is no dynastic question. The throne has its lawful occupant. The king of the Hellenes is Constantine. The leader of our opponents says the people in its great majority does not want King Constantine. We reply, then let the people be asked. And then he goes on to talk about a bunch of constitutional legalities of a referendum and stuff like that. In regards to, quote, the Venizelos tyranny that was plaguing the country, Gounaris states, and quote, 3.5 years have passed since I was forcibly removed from you. Throughout these years, violence and arbitrary rule have been rampant. All personal and political liberties have been shamelessly trampled on in a manner unexampled in history. The constitutional charter has torn up the concepts of justice and law has been dissolved. The church guarding for centuries of the national ideals has been torn down. Justice, the bastion of every free society, despite all the constitutional guarantees of its independence, has been dragged into the whirlpool of the corybantic passions of tyranny. The press, whose freedom is guaranteed by the Constitution, has become the object of a ruthless persecution. The prisons have been filled with citizens unaware of why they have been dragged there. In their tens and hundreds, even in their thousands, those excellent citizens who were displeasing to the tyrants were sent away to the islands of the Aegean. All those civil servants and officers who were suspect of their views were dismissed from their posts. These are facts known to all of you. So, as you can see, this reads kind of like a laundry list of complaints, and it refers to a lot of grievances the opposition had. And I don't believe, and I think that reality shows this, that these were exaggerations. There were internal exiles to the gulags of the Aegean. There were deportations. There were court-martials and martial law and all that stuff. The press was censored as well, and so I don't think the term Venizelos tyranny is exactly hyperbole. It just happens, though, that laws tend to take second place, in times of crisis and war. Greece was definitely in a time of crisis and war. You can look to the American Civil War. Habeas corpus was suspended. This tends to happen, right, throughout history. It's not anything necessarily personal. It's just when you're in a war, elections tend to get delayed and stuff like that goes second place. So, yeah. And really, we can't overlook, not in good faith anyways, we can't pass up what is called the Lazarus Chamber, which was a major point of contention between the monarchists and the Venizelists. So, what was the Lazarus Chamber? Was it a chamber of parliament ran by zombies who also happened to be good friends with Jesus? Not exactly. Was it a chamber of parliament raised from the dead? Sort of. More so, yes. The Lazarus Chamber, as it has notoriously become known as, was a chamber of parliament that was raised, quote unquote, or perhaps summoned is the more appropriate word, after the Novembriana when Venizelos took power back. So to understand it all a little better, let's go back right after Venizelos took power. So like right after the Novembriana, which, again, listen to the episode on Novembriana if you're lost and want to understand more about all this. Anyways, Venizelos took power, and one of the first things he needed was a parliament that was on his side. The current parliament was the parliament from the elections of December of 1915 and was completely devoid of Venizelists, because Venizelos and the boys boycotted that election, a political tactic that we're going to see again and again and again. So to counteract this inconvenient reality, Venizelos brought back the parliament from the June 15th, 1915 elections, a parliament that was conveniently a majority Venizelist. Thus the name the Lazarus Chamber, because it was brought back from the dead, just like Jesus' good friend, Lazarus, right? So what was the reasoning for this pretty brash move on Venizelos' part? Well, Venizelos and crew argued that the chamber was the chamber that was in power post-Novembriana, before the Lazarus Chamber was brought back from the dead, was the result of King Constantine unconstitutionally dissolving that chamber, the Lazarus Chamber that is, when Venizelos resigned, back when the king shot down Venizelos' request to intervene in the aid of the Gallipoli campaign back in 1915. So that is the Lazarus Chamber that was such a hot topic and a point of, quote-unquote Venizelist tyranny, as they would say. The elections ramp up as our story moves on. It was mostly believed by many that Venizelos would win. After all, this was the man that brought Greece as close as it ever could be to the dream of all dreams. But, as we know, the Venizelists and the Entente will be in for an unpleasant surprise. And part of this surprise also stemmed from this overconfidence the Venizelists had in the election, the certainty that the elections would turn out the way they wanted. Let's look at this from a first-hand account from an employee of the Venizelos regime who was stationed out of Thessaloniki on what helped contribute to the stunning loss. So here's a little tidbit, guys, okay? End quote. Such was the spirit of optimism which prevailed that most of the candidates did not even take the trouble to make tours of their countryside. Going from village to village almost on my own, I found everywhere a hidden reaction whose exact force it was impossible to estimate. The opposition avoided holding mass meetings and organized their campaign with great secrecy. The people hid their true feelings on account of terrorism by organs of the gendarme who had got into bad habits owing to their immunity from control during the long period of war. They all came to the Liberal Party, the Venizelos wing, right? The Liberal Party meetings, and listened to the speeches without making the least interruption. At the very end, some lawyer or retired officer, usually from old Greece, would get up at the end of the speech and ask a question or start a discussion. In one village only, Tripniklava, sorry if I messed that name up, near Langada, the inhabitants left us in no doubt as to their feelings. We knew that the atmosphere in this village was hostile because in 1917, after the Salonika Revolution, the inhabitants had refused to be mobilized, and Kondilis, we know Kondilis guys, right? General Kondilis, to punish them, had sent a detachment which burnt all the barns in the village. We arrived in the evening, 5 or 6 candidates, and asked that the people gather in the school to hear us. When all the inhabitants were gathered together, one of the candidates, Alexander Letsas, a popular and eloquent speaker, made a speech whose main theme was the success of Venizelos' foreign policy. The audience followed it to the end in dead silence, but as soon as he finished, the old guys got up together shouted, "Long live Constantine," and left the hall. End quote. And that was a first-hand account by Alexander Pallis, worker in the Venizelos regime and on the campaign trail of 1920. As you can see, he touches on some grievances, right? Mobilization and heavy-handedness by the Venizelos police officers and military administration. Also, again, Venis Kondilis, right? We caught that familiar name, General Kondilis, burning barns and, being that quote-unquote thunderbolt of a man that he was, as Metaxas referred to him one time. That was his nickname, too, the Thunderbolt, right? We know Kondilis. Big name, Kingmaker. So, yeah, it's a big deal, this stuff, this oppression. Something else which caught my eyes, like this, the scene of all this quote, this is this Langada basin. It's the same area where Dr. Anastasia Caracasidu, she uses as a case study in her book, Fields of Wheat, Hills of Blood. It's like she does a case study in a specific area, yada, yada, yada. Super interesting book. So I just thought that was an interesting overlap I noticed. So anyways, as you can walk away with, people were pissed, and Election Day showed it. While the Venizelists lost outright in Parliament with only 118 out of 369 seats, the actual percentage of those who voted for Venizelos was much closer, something around 40 to 44%. So the election was close, but no cigar-ish. And as much as the military and population voted for the monarchists with the hope of an end to the Asia Minor campaign and demobilization, kind of bring the boys back home now, the monarchists themselves never actually stated very specifically that they would demobilize or end the war. Many just seemed to infer it due to the bad relations between the Entente and the king, the monarchists, right? And that the opposition party was anti-Venizelists, right? So of course they're going to do whatever the opposite is of that. Anyways, you guys get the idea. There's not much more reason to continue on about going why Venizelos lost. What I'd really love to get into is why Venizelos held elections. Just like wait a little longer. Like just don't hold, like there's times in history, I think we talked about this quote in one of the previous episodes with Zavitianos, who was like a minister who went back and forth between the left and the right, yada yada. He was a minister in the Metaxas regime. He was under the Venizelos regime, all types of stuff. And like there's a quote where Venizelos talks about, there's just pretty much the whole point of the quote is that the nation comes above everything else, right? Even like you wanting to hold elections, like there's a time and a place for everything. That's what you shouldn't do, is hold elections at a time. Anyways, we'll talk about that another time. One last thing I want to leave you with, though, is this really great convo Venizelos had with his good friend George Ventris. And he stated quite bluntly that, and quote, Venizelos is saying this, okay, "I have explained to you repeatedly that I am not made of the stuff of which dictators are made. I would loathe myself if against the will of the people I had continued to govern because I considered myself better than the rest." Say what you will about that quote and about Venizelos, because, he said that whenever he said that, but his actions in 1933 and 1935 arguably run against that quote, but whatever, okay? So that's a whole nother conversation to have. Let's move on. I know we've talked a bit about Venizelos here for a while, and how can we not? Don't want to overdo it. We'll get into Venizelos and Venizelism and stuff one day. We know already what comes next. Elections have consequences, lead to changes in political leadership. And those said changes in our story led to military purges, which helped lead to defeat, helped lead, anyways, I should say, to the megali idea, the grand idea turning to ash. Let's zoom in on that, slow it down a bit, drill down a bit more, okay? So after everything is finalized and tallied on November 14th, Venizelos hears of his defeat, his electoral defeat, and without waiting any longer, goes into a self-imposed exile in Paris. Before doing so, he hands his resignation to colleague and politician Admiral Koundouriotis, who was deemed the regent by Venizelos. According to the monarchists, this was bullshit. They believed that Queen Olga, the royal dowager, and the widow of the assassinated King George I was the true regent. So anyways, Koundouriotis then submits his resignation, Queen Olga becomes the new regent, and a new cabinet is sworn in. Then in early December, a referendum was held on bringing back the king, which produced a 99% vote in favor of bringing back King Constantine. Totally legit. And this is totally the first time that we've heard this story before, where a result yields a 99% vote, right? Of course, it won't be the first or the last. We know of another one, the 1935 referendum, when Condilis brings back the king, which is their primer series. So anyways, yeah. When checking in with the Entente and the players in Asia Minor, while the results of the elections were fresh out of the box, a diplomatic note coming from the British, France, and Italy stated, and quote, "The restoration of the throne to Greece of a king whose disloyal attitude and conduct towards the Allies during the war caused them great embarrassment and loss could only be regarded by them as a ratification by Greece of his hostile acts," end quote. So as you can see, these guys are still very salty about the Novembriana. The new government, though, who was led by Prime Minister Dimitrios Rallis, came out officially and said there would be no change in their foreign policy. Even so, the result of the election in and of itself helped widen and expose cracks between the French, British, and Italians, and conversations on what was really going on in Asia Minor, and if this was the best plan of action, started to arise. So what happens next, guys? And like I've said before, I'm going to try to cover a little more in depth these episodes than I have on previous primer episodes I've covered, but not too much at the same time. Why not too much? One, because I want to have a segment in the future on the Asia Minor campaign because it's fucking awesome. It is such a wild ride and it's really interesting and it deserves its own series if this whole podcast project makes it that far too. Also, like I said earlier, I want to have an episode on Venizelism a bit later, so we'll save all that for later, right? So what happens next? In a nutshell, these conversations, the winning great powers of World War I were having of what to do with Greece, resulted in France taking a very hostile position, joined by Italy, while Britain was a bit split, let's say, on what to do. The position of what to do resulted in the three powers, deciding to maintain Severus, but withdrawing financial support of the campaign, which of course affected the economy because now the very fragile Greek economy had to carry the entire burden of supporting some 100,000 or so troops in Asia Minor and Thrace. This action taken by the Entente forces also had the effect of causing the drachma to drop in value and blocked Greece's ability to raise foreign loans to help finance everything. So just a big shit sandwich all around. Not great stuff, right? Also, let's not forget that a change of government just occurred. And I don't know if this is your first episode of this segment of the Greek Civil War segment that we're running, was really turned into a segment of many facets of modern Greek history. But if you are in fact new to this, as a rule of thumb, anytime a new government comes into power, just expect purges, right? It just comes along with they're buddy with each other. New government, purges, right? So, purges. The Royalists purged everything from universities to the judiciary to bishops to the church to public servants. The famous writer and author Nikos Kazantzakis, who was appointed as head of the Ministry of Relief, also fell victim to the purge. But of course, the purge that is central to the big fucking deal currently in progress was the purge of the military, right? Now, at surface level, we call this a purge because it worked kind of de facto like a purge. But the term, when applied like this, is a bit of a misnomer. Let me explain. Back in our primer episodes, those first four, and I looked this up, I stated something along the lines of, quote, King Constantine I returned to power in November of 1920 via elections and a referendum, then replaces the vast majority of the most experienced and competent Venizelist generals and officers with a slew of inept royalist generals and commanders on the Asia Minor front, yada, yada, yada. Right. That's literally what I said word for word, apparently. And while this isn't the most thorough take on it, it's maybe even a bit misleading, it was a very generalized one, which was fitting for the ultra primers that the first four episodes were. Back to that misnomer, right? Purge. And what actually happened. What actually happened was that when the Royalists got back into power, they re-enlisted these group of army officers called the Apotacti, which translates to English as the absentees. These Apotacti were army officers who had been dismissed, resigned, or put on reserve under the Venizelist regime from 1917 to 1920, some 1,500 officers in all. This was done via a royal decree after the king returned via the referendum. Now, to understand the issue of the Apotacti, we need to understand the notorious Law 927 of 1917, which was a law put in during Venizelos' regime in 1917. This law created another law called the, Decamenon, which translates roughly to 10 months, and it created 10 months of military service to Venizelist army officers during the tumult of the events around the time of the Novriana. So these guys, the absentees or apotacti, get reinstated, recredited for their time off. 3 years, give or take, which of course in some cases now has them passing up the former Venizelist officers in charge, the guys who took their jobs originally. Which, if you haven't noticed, this is kind of like a royalist version of the Decameron law. Just like 3 years instead of 10 months. You get the idea? But, one's Venizelist flavored, one's royalist flavored. And to be clear, some really big names in the military, people like Plastiras, Condilis, and Pangalos, had all gotten ahead due to Law 927, right? All Venizelist generals, Condilis later goes monarcho-fascist, but at the time, all Venizelist, staunchly Venizelist generals. Not to say they weren't great officers, or commanders, and they had only gotten ahead due to being Venizelos and getting preferential treatment. I mean, even Pangalos, for the reputation he has, he was still considered as a very competent military officer, right? So yeah, these Venizelos generals that had gotten ahead while the Apoctati were sidelined, well, their advancement caused a lot of resentment coming from the royalists, the Apoctati. So how did this new shuffle look in practice? Well, in some cases, officers could have their pay drastically reduced or their position could be temporarily suspended until the new proper ranking order was restored, which meant some Apoctati became your new boss. And keep in mind, the entire commanding structure just got 1,500 seats bigger. So there came to be a bit of obsolescence in positions, like how many generals or divisional commanders or whatever in whatever position do you really need? And as we'll see, that will result in many being placed on leave or suspended temporarily. So that's what I meant when I said earlier that using the word purge in this example is a bit of a misnomer. Now, while there wasn't a formal purge, there wasn't anything preventing the Venizelos from purging themselves. In response to this reshuffle and the returning of these Apoctati, 150 Venizelos officers, 4 of them generals, deserted their posts and linked up with the National Defense, or Aminas, movement in Constantinople, which was a group of Venizelos Republican army officers who were scheming on the sidelines, let's say. In fact, by the time the spring offensive against the Kemalists in 1921 would start, only 2 of the previous Army Corps divisional commanders were still in charge, Trikoupis and Leonardopoulos. 3 of the Army Corps commanders, 7 out of 9 divisional commanders, had also been replaced. So a bit of a purge in that respect, you could say. De facto purge, let's put it. And then you had Condilis, who was mobbed by troops apparently for his forcefulness during the elections and only escaped by hiding under a train. Pretty out of character and humiliating for a guy like Condilis, right? So, yeah. And just for a moment, I want to zoom in on the commander-in-chief of Asia Minor at the time. A small tidbit I found super interesting. It has to do with Anastasios Papoulas, who was the commander-in-chief of all forces in Asia Minor before the royalists came back into power, was General Paraskevopulos. He ended up resigning and was replaced by General Papoulas, who apparently was considered very capable of bridging the gap between the Venizelists and royalists, and worked towards reconciliation, something much needed. And, quote, I decided to remove immediately from the Asia Minor army, and I did so, those elements that were irreconcilable and in my view, incapable of putting the general interest of the country above all else. A bit more on Papoulas. He had been imprisoned in Crete in 1918 for organizing guerrilla warfare against Venizelists. Royalists, he was a royalist, right? Later, Papoulas will be one of those military officers who participated in the 1935 failed Republican coup, and he was put to death for his participation. Think about that. Think about that for a second. Going from imprisoned for fighting against the Venizelists to dying for them in 1935. What a change time can do 15 years later. And really this, I think this attests to the kind of the nature of the Greek political scene, right? As we're going to see, these guys switch sides all the time. It's not taboo to switch one side to the other. Another interesting fate that many of these resigned, replaced, or suspended officers faced, former Venizelos officers I'm referring to, of course, was a type of internal exile. Captain Sarafis, for example, he will come up in our story a little bit later, was sentenced to a house arrest of sorts, but instead of a house arrest, it was like a city arrest. He was like under house arrest, but in Kalamata, where him and 30 or so other Venizelos officers were internally exiled to and forbidden to leave. All in all, when you count officers and commanders who were replaced, deserted, or who were removed from active service or kept in one form of suspension or another, the number by some notable historians like Thanos Varemis reaches 600 officers. Michael Llewelyn-Smith says 500. And I'm getting these numbers and a lot of this info from Thanos Varemis' book, The Military and Greek Politics. Great read. Thanks for the recommendation on that, Dr. Pappas. Yeah. And of course, Ionian Vision, another classic. I've already mentioned that at least once this episode. Which, by the way, actually, I had found the 500 and figured also matched in another book called Salvation and Catastrophe. Has a lot of authors, but I think the main guy who wrote it or whatever was, what's his name? Travalos is the last name. That book's a little more technical. It's like really numbers and stuff, but it's a really great book too. I've tried reading it, but I just don't have time to finish it. So the 500 figure I think is probably like the most accurate-ish, but I don't know. Thanos Varemis is an amazing author as well, and just these guys are all amazing historians, so I don't want to put one above the other. And Thanos Varemis has written just an amazing amount of Greek history, especially around this time period. Anyways, I'll cut myself off from rambling there. That is it for today. Please join us next time as we continue our journey and continue to work our way through this royalty primer and look at the ongoing effects of the November 1920 elections on the Asia Minor campaign. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.